At 2:30 in the morning on October 24, 1940, the night sky over Guadalcanal was entirely swallowed by a torrential downpour, and the darkness was thick with a suffocating sense of despair. Rain mixed with churning mud soaked through the uniform of United States Marine Sergeant John Basilone as he knelt in the muck, his hands gripping the spade grips of a Browning M1917 heavy machine gun. The barrel was already searing hot from continuous firing, and the sharp, acrid stench of burning machine oil from the overheated metal permeated the humid air. Basilone's hands were covered in raw, bleeding blisters for 36 grueling hours. He had not closed his eyes for a single second, nor had he swallowed a single bite of food. Suddenly, through the pitch-black dead silence of the jungle, that blood-curdling sound approached once again. At first, it was just a faint rustling in the towering elephant grass, followed by the violent snapping of vegetation. Then the noises converged into a frenzied, deafening roar that tore through the night. Banzai. 3,000 elite soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army's famed Sendai Division were surging directly toward his position like a tidal wave. These fanatical troops were sprinting over the lifeless bodies of their own comrades who had fallen in the charges just an hour or even minutes before. Stepping on the flesh and bone of their brothers in arms, as if crossing stepping stones in a river, they threw themselves relentlessly into the teeth of the American guns. Basilone clenched his jaw and squeezed the trigger. The heavy machine gun erupted into a deafening roar, spitting red tracer rounds that sliced through the rainy night like the scythe of the Grim Reaper. Rows of Japanese soldiers were mowed down like wheat, but more instantly filled the gaps, rushing blindly forward over the mounting piles of the dead. Deep in a concealed bunker miles behind the Japanese lines, Lieutenant General Hiroki Kai Hyakutake was straining to hear the distant cacophony of gunfire, anxiously waiting for the glorious news that Henderson Field had finally fallen. He had personally guaranteed a decisive victory to his superiors in Tokyo. After all, he had amassed a formidable force of 15,000 men on Guadalcanal, complete with heavy artillery, tanks, and the full, undisputed backing of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Even Admiral Roku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was personally coordinating a massive fleet operation to support this world-altering ground assault. In Hyakutake's mind, the Japanese possessed the ultimate strategic advantage. The Haikom that in Tokyo universally believed that Americans were oft decadent and utterly incapable of fighting a real war. According to traditional Japanese military doctrine, American soldiers lacked the endurance, the grit, and the spiritual fortitude required for brutal close quarters combat and the willingness to die for their country. Hyakutake was supremely confident that by the time the sun rose, the American flag flying over Henderson Field would be torn down and replaced by the rising sun. However, brutal reality was about to deliver a shattering blow. He was catastrophically wrong. Over the next 72 hours, this arrogant, massive assault on Henderson Field would not become a glorious Japanese triumph. Instead, it would degenerate into one of the most horrific, lopsided disasters in the entire history of the Pacific War. The Sendai Division, one of the most combat-experienced and elite units in the Japanese military, was about to be utterly annihilated. The corpses of Japanese soldiers would pile up so high against the American barbed wire that Marine engineers would later have to use bulldozers to bury the mountainous heaps of the dead. The casualty ratio of this battle was so incredibly disproportionate that when the initial reports reached Washington, D.C., even American intelligence analysts refused to believe the numbers. The Japanese soldiers were blindly marching into a highly precise, ruthlessly efficient industrial meat grinder, completely unaware of the doom that awaited them. To truly understand why the Japanese attack on Henderson Field became a disaster of epic proportions, we must zoom out and look at the airfield itself, unpacking its immense strategic value. You have to ask yourself, why were both sides willing to throw every chip they had onto the table for a crude dirt runway carved out of a remote, disease-ridden jungle island that most Americans couldn't even point to on a map? Henderson Field was not just a runway, it was the absolute master key to controlling the vital lifelines of the entire South Pacific. Rewind to the summer of 1940, to when Japanese generals unfurled their maps of the Pacific. They looked upon an empire of unprecedented scale stretching from the Japanese home islands all the way south to the Dutch East Indies, west into Burma and east to the Marshall Islands. In just 6 short months, the territory conquered by the Japanese military had expanded faster than any empire in human history. They had humiliated the British at Singapore, driven the Americans out of the Philippines, and crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Yet behind the seemingly unstoppable momentum of this massive imperial war machine lay a fatal Achilles heel. Japan's military was entirely dependent on oil, the precious oil fields they had just captured in the Dutch East Indies, worth thousands of miles away from the home islands. The oil tankers carrying the black blood of the empire had to traverse vast stretches of ocean that were becoming increasingly vulnerable to American submarine and dare attacks. To protect this fragile lifeline, the Japanese urgently needed to push their defensive perimeter even further south. They needed to sever the vital maritime supply route between the United States and Australia. They needed to eliminate the last major Allied base threat in the region. To achieve this grand strategic objective, they set their sights on a specific location, Guadalcanal. Lying quietly at the southern end of the Solomon Islands chain, Guadalcanal was a green nightmare of impenetrable jungles, jagged mountains, and lethal tropical diseases. In May 1940, two Japanese engineering units landed on the flat coastal plains of northern Guadalcanal and began working around the clock to carve out an airfield. They cleared the dense elephant grass, laid down a runway made of crushed coral, and shipped in heavy machinery from their major base at Rabaul. By early August, the runway was nearing completion. Once operational, Japanese bombers flying from this strip could easily drop death upon Australia, and Japanese fighter planes could ruthlessly intercept any Allied convoy attempting to resupply the South Pacific. At that fateful moment, the strategic balance of the entire war was on the verge of a permanent shift, and the Americans absolutely could not allow that to happen. Consequently, on August 7, 1940, a sudden thunderous operation was launched. 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal in America's first major amphibious assault since the Spanish-American War. Catching the Japanese completely off guard, the Marines pushed rapidly into the jungle and captured the nearly completed airfield within 36 hours. In honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had perished at the Battle of Midway just 2 months prior, the Americans solemnly christened the dirt strip Henderson Field. But the true grinding horror of the campaign was only just beginning. The Japanese Haikom refused to swallow this bitter pill. They simply could not accept the loss of Guadalcanal. This was not merely a tactical setback, it was a brazen insult to the pride of the empire. How dare these Americans, whom they considered weak and pleasure-obsessed, take the offensive? Admiral Yamamoto keenly sensed the impending crisis. Having spent years in the United States as a naval attaché, he had witnessed the sprawling automobile plants of Detroit and the bustling shipyards of the West Coast. He knew better than anyone in Tokyo that if the Americans were given enough time to mobilize their terrifying industrial might, Japan would be crushed. The Americans had to be stopped on Guadalcanal. They had to be driven back into the sea. Henderson Field had to be retaken before the tide of the war turned forever. And so a desperate, bloody, months-long struggle over a lonely strip of dirt in the middle of nowhere officially began. Just 2 weeks after the American landing, the first fierce Japanese counterattack struck like a hurricane. Colonel Kyo N.A., Oichiki, an arrogant and supremely confident infantry commander, lead 900 soldiers, men thoroughly indoctrinated with the spirit of Bushido, on a nighttime assault across the Tene-Aru River. Oichiki was certain that once these pampered American boys faced the gleaming steel of Japanese bayonets and brutal hand-to-hand combat, they would break and run. Instead, they were met by the cold and forgiving reality of intersecting heavy machine gun fire and devastating American artillery barrages. The horrific slaughter across the sandbar lasted less than 12 hours and ended in the total annihilation of the Japanese force. Over 800 Japanese bodies choked the blood-red waters of the river or hung lifelessly on the American barbed wire. In utter despair and profound humiliation, Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. While the Americans viewed this as a massive victory, Tokyo brushed it off as a minor inconsequential tactical delay. To the Imperial General Headquarters, the situation on Guadalcanal had become a bone caught in their throat, impossible to swallow, yet demanding to be chewed. The Americans were not crumbling, they were in around Henderson Field like stubborn nails. Thus, in September, a second, far more ferocious wave of attacks descended. This time, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi led 3,100 troops through the deep jungle, attempting a sweeping flanking maneuver to strike the supposedly weak southern perimeter of the American lines. On paper, it was a brilliant tactical stroke, but the jungle of Guadalcanal proved to be an enemy far more terrifying than American bullets. It took Kawaguchi's men for agonizing days to hack their way through 8 miles of green hell. By the time they reached their jump-off points, the soldiers were severely dehydrated, malnourished, and their radio communications were completely dead. In the ensuing night bloodbath that would become known as the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Japanese threw themselves into the marine defenses like moths drawn to a flame. When the smoke finally cleared, over 1,000 more Japanese soldiers lay dead. Kawaguchi's shattered remnants had no choice but to melt back into the jungle, left to rot from starvation and tropical disease. These consecutive humiliating defeats finally shattered Tokyo's patience, the Haikom, and woke up to the grim reality that the Americans were not soft and Guadalcanal was not going to be easily reclaimed. It was time to go all in. A massive reinforcement plan was set into motion. The elite 2nd Division, the vaunted Sendai Division, was urgently deployed to the island. Recruited largely from the rugged Miyagi Prefecture in northern Japan, these men were legendary for their iron discipline and ferocious fighting style. They had battled through the freezing snows of Manchuria and swept through the Dutch East Indies. They were universally recognized as one of the deadliest formations in the Japanese Army. Beginning in early October, a fleet of Japanese destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express by the Americans, utilized the cover of darkness to sprint down the narrow waters of the Solomons, offloading thousands of troops, artillery pieces, and supplies onto the Guadalcanal coast. Before dawn, the ghost ships would vanish back up the slots to avoid American dive bombers. Night after night, the build-up continued. By mid-October, over 15,000 Japanese troops were secretly massed on the island, equipped with heavy artillery and even light tanks. To ensure absolute success, Lieutenant General Hyakutake personally landed on the island to take direct command of this massive killing machine. Hyakutake didn't just send his infantry in blindly, he orchestrated a prelude of unprecedented devastation. At 1:33 in the morning on October 14th, the dark horizon out at sea erupted in blinding flashes, followed by the terrifying earth-shattering shriek of incoming artillery. To Leviathan-ness of the combined fleet, the battleship Skongo at Haruna had quietly slipped into the waters off Guadalcanal. These 30,000-ton behemoths leveled their massive 14-inch main guns directly at Henderson Field. For the next 83 minutes, 973 massive armor-piercing and high explosive shells rained down on the Marine positions like a meteor shower. Each shell weighed over 1,400 pounds, leaving craters large enough to swallow a house. For the Marines huddled in their trenches, it was the most terrifying night of their lives. A pharmacist's mate named Luis Ortega would later recall the hellish scene with a shudder. First came the bone-chilling whistle, and then the deafening roar of the whole world being torn apart. That 83-minute nightmare would forever be known to the survivors simply as the bombardment. When dawn broke, Henderson Field was a smoking, apocalyptic wasteland. The runways were pockmarked, like the surface of the moon. Of the 90 American aircraft stationed there, 48 were reduced to twisted, burning scrap metal. Almost the entire stockpile of aviation fuel went up in a towering inferno, and 41 Americans, including 6 irreplaceable pilots, were killed instantly. This was just a naval bombardment, it was a psychological and physical crucifixion of the American defenders. Looking at the devastated airfield, Hyakutake was convinced the moment of ultimate victory was at hand. He drafted a complex, grandiose, and ultimately fatal battle plan. He divided his massive force intending to crush the American perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. His biggest gamble and his most catastrophic error was ordering Major General Masao Maruyama to take 7,200 elite soldiers of the Sendai Division on a deep, sweeping flanking march through the jungle to strike the Marines from the south. On a map, it was a mere 15-mile journey for highly trained infantry. It should have been a brisk day's march. But the Guadalcanal jungle immediately bared its fangs to the proud Japanese troops. There were no roads, only a chaotic labyrinth of tangled vines, towering ancient trees, bottomless mud pits, and disease-carrying insects. With every step, soldiers sank up to their knees in rotting muck. Lacking pack animals, every heavy machine gun, artillery shell, and dismantled mountain gun had to be dragged by hand, hauled up impossibly steep, slick ravines using ropes. The stagnant air was breathless, the humidity and agonizing 100% and torrential rains fell like clockwork. The men quickly ran out of purified water and were forced to drink from stagnant, foul-smelling puddles. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever tore through the ranks. Worse still was the hunger. Many soldiers, desperate to shed weight, abandoned their life-saving rations, and gear the 7,200-man column completely lost cohesion. Radios shorted out in the dampness, leaving the command structure paralyzed. The grand assault, originally scheduled for October 22nd, was pushed back to the 23rd, and finally, because the exhausted troops simply cowed and reached their jump-off points in time, delayed until October 24th. Tragically for the Japanese, the breakdown in communications meant that the diversionary forces never received the order to delay. On the evening of October 23rd, Japanese tanks and infantry stationed at the mouth of the Montanic-Ao River blindly launched their scheduled assault. They were met by American 37mm anti-tank guns waiting in ambush. 9 Japanese light tanks were systematically blown to pieces on the sandbar, their burning, twisted wreckage serving as a grim monument to the catastrophic failure of Japanese coordination. All the while, Maruyama's main force was still stumbling through the lightless, suffocating jungle. Finally, the night of October 24th arrived. Maruyama's 7,000 surviving men broke through the tree line and gathered to the direct south of the American perimeter. They had been fighting the jungle for days, completely exhausted and desperately thirsty, yet the fanatical fire of Bushido still burned in their veins. Standing in their way was the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by a man who would soon become a Marine Corps legend, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller. Puller had barely 1,000 men to defend a wildly overextended 2,000-yard line, carving through the jungle edge, relying entirely on isolated fighting holes and interlocking machine gun nests. On this pitch-black, rain-soaked night, a meat grinder that would determine the fate of the Pacific was about to be switched on. Situated at the absolute most critical choke point of Puller's line was the machine gun emplacement commanded by Sergeant John Basilone. As the minutes ticked by at 11:30 in the evening, the forward Marine listening posts finally detected an unnatural rustling in the dark. Soon the blood-curdling roar of the Banzai charge pierced the torrential rain. The Japanese tactic was brutal in its simplicity, overwhelm the American firepower with sheer human mass. The very first wave slammed directly into Basilone's sector back in Puller's Muddycombe, and post the crank of the field telephone spun wildly. The frantic, terrified voice of Sergeant Ralph Briggs at the listening post crackled through the earpiece. "Colonel, there are about 3,000 enemy soldiers between me and you. They are all around us, singing, smoking, and heading your way fast." Puller's knuckles turned white as he gripped the receiver, but his response was ice cold and resolute. "Let them come." At 1:15 in the morning, the gates of hell were blown off their hinges. With deafening fanatical screams, an ocean of khaki-clad figures, wielding fixed bayonets, surged out of the black jungle. There was no tactical maneuvering, no seeking cover. They ran upright chests, bared, throwing hand grenades, into the Marine foxholes in a massive suicidal wave. At the extreme right flank of the line, the anchor point of the entire defense, Sergeant Basil once screamed the order to fire. His water-cooled Browning heavy machine gun spatter, blinding half-meter-long flame into the dark, its rhythmic thumping roar drowning out the thunder above. Firing at 500 rounds per minute, the gun wove an impenetrable wall of lead. Dozens of the vanguard Japanese soldiers were ripped apart in mid-stride, severed limbs flying into the air. But the Sendai Division did not know how to retreat. As the first wave fell, the second instantly climbed over their twitching bodies and kept running, using their own dead to fill the defensive trenches and bridge the barbed wire. Basil I's vision was illuminated entirely by the eerie glow of tracers, the air thick with the nauseating stench of copper, blood, and cordite. Suddenly, disaster struck on his left flank. A sister machine gun jammed and went silent under a barrage of Japanese mortar fire, its crew dead or wounded. A lethal gap opened in the perimeter, and dozens of blood-crazed Japanese infantrymen immediately swarmed toward the breach. Basil I didn't hesitate. In an act of sheer madness, he hoisted one of the 90-pound spare heavy machine guns onto his shoulders and sprinted through the knee-deep mud and flying shrapnel, diving into the compromised position. Bullets snapped past his ears and mortars through geysers of mud around him, but he miraculously survived the dash, mounted the gun, and opened fire, instantly cutting down the Japanese soldiers who were mere feet away. But the crisis was over. The astronomical rate of fire meant ammunition was running dangerously low. As the canvas belts neared their end, Basil I drew his M1911 pistol, grabbed a heavy machete in his other hand, and plunged into the overrun communication trenches like a cornered tiger. Fighting in desperate hand-to-hand combat, he hacked and shot his way through the Japanese infiltrators, physically dragging heavy crates of ammunition back from the rear dumps to keep his guns fed. The water in the gun's cooling jacket had boiled away long ago, and the glowing red barrel was hot enough to ignite the surrounding foliage. Without asbestos gloves, Basil I grabbed the searing metal with his bare hands to swap out the melted barrel. The extreme heat instantly seared the flesh from his palms, but acting as if he felt no pain, he reloaded, aimed, and fired again and again. 36 hours. For 36 agonizing hours, kneeling in a mixture of mud, blood, and spent brass, he stood like a relentless god of war, ensuring that wave after wave of Japanese infantry permanently joined the earth surrounding Henderson Field. Meanwhile, back at the cannon post, as the Japanese pressure mounted to a breaking point, an officer looked at the buckling lines and desperately suggested to Puller that they order a retreat. The battle-hardened Marine drew his pistol, looked around the muddy bunker, and spat out a phrase that would be immortalized in Marine Corps history: "We don't retreat. There is no retreat in the Marine Corps. If necessary, we die right here today." That ironclad vow rippled down the line, giving every mud-caked Marine the spiritual strength to hold their ground to the last man. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the dense storm clouds on the morning of October 25th, the scene illuminated on that cursed battlefield left every survivor scarred for life. Even hardened combat medics vomited at the sight in the cleared fire lanes. Japanese bodies were stacked so densely they formed literal walls of flesh. Directly in front of Basil I's gun, alone within a mere 50-yard arc, lay the pulverized remains of 38 Japanese soldiers. Along Puller's 2,000-yard perimeter, well over 1,000 Imperial troops lay dead. The Marines couldn't even bury the dead by hand. They had to commandeer heavy bulldozers to gouge massive mass graves at the jungle edge, plowing the once proud soldiers into the dirt like industrial waste. The brutal arithmetic of the battle was staggering and absurd. Over 3 days of relentless night attacks, the Sendai Division suffered between 2,000 and 3,000 killed in action. The American Marines lost fewer than 100 men. It was never a battle. It was a unilateral slaughter, the tragic, inevitable result of antiquated cold steel fanaticism crashing headfirst into modern industrialized firepower. Watching the catastrophe unfold through his binoculars from a distant ridge, General Hyakutake finally closed his eyes in agony. His grand operational plan, his personal guarantee to the Emperor, had all evaporated in front of the American barbed wire. The shattered remnants of his elites, Sendai Division, starving, disease, and broken, could do nothing but crawl back into the endless green hell from which they came. But the jungle offered no mercy because the Americans firmly controlled Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force commanded the skies during the day, entirely severing the Japanese supply lines. Guadalcanal quickly transformed into what the Japanese would fearfully call Starvation Island. Over the ensuing months, tens of thousands of Japanese troops hiding in the canopy didn't die from American bullets. They were slowly, agonizingly erased by starvation, malaria, and dysentery. They stripped the jungle of edible weeds, chewed on tree bark, and hunted rats and lizards. Everyday skeletal men collapsed into the mud, never to rise again. Simultaneously, on the water surrounding the island, the United States and Japanese navies engaged in naval brawls of mythical violence. Cruisers and battleships blasted each other at point-blank range in the dead of night, leaving the sea choked with burning steel and drowning sailors. Though the United States Navy paid a horrific price in sunken ships, they held the line like a rabid pit bull, permanently strangling Japan's ability to reinforce the island. The game was over in late January of 1943. Under the desperate cover of destroyers, the Japanese executed Operation K, their first massive military withdrawal of the Pacific War. Some 10,000 emaciated ghost-like survivors were secretly evacuated in the night, leaving behind the rotting bones of over 20,000 of their brothers in the tropical heat. The Battle of Guadalcanal, average 6-month meat grinder, ended in a total, undisputed American victory. This horrific struggle over a dirt runway profoundly altered the trajectory of the Second World War. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility on the ground and marked the exact historical pivot point where the Japanese Empire transitioned from strategic expansion into a desperate defensive collapse. After Guadalcanal, the Japanese war machine would never again launch a strategic offensive in the Pacific. They would only retreat island by bloody island, crushed by the overwhelming weight of American industry, until they were backed into the corner of their own burning home islands. As for Sergeant John Basilone, the man who burned his hands on the machine gun barrel and fought like a demon in the mud, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. He was the first enlisted Marine of World War II to receive the honor. Because his story was so deeply inspiring, the military brought him home, assigning him to a safe, glamorous desk job touring the country to sell war bonds. Surrounded by flashing cameras, adoring crowds, and movie stars, Basilone could have safely lived out the rest of his life in peace. Yet the born warrior rejected the comfort looking at his frantic admirers. He stated quietly, "I am not a hero and I am not a museum piece. I belong back with my unit, with my boys." In February 1945, more than 2 years after the nightmare on Guadalcanal, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone voluntarily returned to the Pacific. He stormed the black volcanics as of a far more terrible island, Iwo Jima. On the very first day of the invasion, while once again charging forward to destroy a Japanese blockhouse and free his pinned-down Marines, he was struck by an enemy mortar shell and killed instantly. He was 28 years old. He paid for the Marine Corps out of no retreat with his own life. Over 80 years have passed since those dark nights. Today, if you take a modern commercial flight and land smoothly on the wide concrete runway of Haneda International Airport in the Solomon Islands, it is difficult to fathom just how much blood, tragedy, and unyielding spirit is buried beneath the tarmac. This is Henderson Field. The land that was once cratered like the moon by naval artillery is now covered in lush green grass, swept by a gentle ocean breeze. The soldiers who slaughtered each other over this lifeline, the young men who screamed and died in the torrential rain, have long since turned to dust in the tropical soil. But the smoke of history never truly dissipates in the overgrown remnants of foxholes at the edge of the airport. In the rusted shell casings occasionally washed up by the rain, the echoes of that epic collision still whisper to anyone willing to listen. It is a story of courage, fanaticism, and the brutal crushing of human flesh by industrial machinery. It was not just the end of a battle, it was the death knell of an arrogant empire and an eternal monument, forged purely of iron and blood in the history of human warfare. If you want more deep dives into the battlefields that shaped our modern world, hit that subscribe button. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.